Well, it's my pleasure this evening to welcome Grant Bartley, who is the editor of Philosophy Now, and he's going to speak to us about consciousness and its interaction with artificial intelligence.
Yes.
Consciousness is a problem which some people think is so difficult that it will be totally impossible, and others question whether there is a problem at all. But I think I'd like to hand you over now to Grant.
Hello, everybody. I hope you can all see me. My first thing is, it's a good day to be talking about artificial intelligence and artificial consciousness because it's May the 4th, which you may or may not know is official Star Wars Day. So a good day for artificial consciousness discussions. So second, thank you for the privilege of my being able to share my consciousness with such an intelligent group of people. In the first part of the talk, I want to talk about ideas about what it means for a machine to be conscious as opposed to being just intelligent. Are you seeing the slides now? Hang on a second. I'm just trying to bring up the slides, if you excuse me. Is that working? Slides now?
That's good now, yes.
Okay. Then after I've considered the difference between consciousness and intelligence, I want to look briefly about what it might take to honestly create what we might call artificial consciousness. So if you are intelligent, it will be unsurprising to you that intelligence is a vital concept for artificial intelligence to pin down and consciousness for artificial consciousness to pin down for the discussion. So for the sake of argument, let me use fairly standard definitions. To start with then, intelligence is the ability to solve novel problems. My first question examining intelligence is then, does this ability refer merely to behavior, or does intelligence imply consciousness? Or by contrast, does artificial intelligence mean a computer acting to solve novel problems without necessarily implying any conscious awareness? And what's the difference between a machine merely behaving as if it were conscious and a machine actually being conscious anyway? So by conscious awareness, I specifically mean the having of subjective experience. So in what has become a standard phrase in philosophy of mind, consciousness involves there being something it's like to be something. There is something it's like to be you having the experiences you're having now, just as there is presumably something it's like to be a bat, having a bat experience, or a cat having a cat. So to say that computers do not have consciousness is to say that there is nothing it is like to be that computer. It lacks subjective experience. This could be the case regardless of how intelligently it responds to the environment. The ability to solve problems is an independent issue. A machine could surpass a person in solving specific problems, but not possess an iota of subjective experience. Now, perhaps you will allow me to say that the present goal of AI research is to make machines function in an intelligent manner. But notice here that the intelligence of the machine is defined in terms of its functioning, that is, in terms of its behavior. Mere behavior does not necessarily imply any sort of consciousness. It doesn't rule it out either, but rather consciousness is in fact superfluous to a definition of intelligence based on observable behavior. So there's a conceptual distinction between a machine set up to behave intelligently by solving problems, but which has no conscious experience, which is in other words, non-conscious, and a machine which has conscious experience, which one supposes would behave intelligently too. So I want to firmly establish this distinction between intelligent behavior and consciousness by highlighting two types of information processing in the human brain. We'll look at the brain's processing of visual information, for which there are both conscious and non-conscious pathways. In the first pathway, subjective experience is involved, and in the second, it isn't. Now, academics often talk in terms of percepts or qualia, but I'll talk in terms of sensations, since I prefer to use everyday language when possible. Now, sensations, percepts, or qualia are those qualities of subjective experience we associate with our senses, unsurprisingly. Specifically, they're the experiential products associated with or produced by your sense mechanisms prior to the use of language. So the colors you see, the sounds you hear, the taste on your tongue, and so on. So the blackness of someone's hair, the taste of wheat in a beer, all the notes of the smell of a perfume on skin, or the harmonics of a grand piano in a smoky bar. They'll all be what I call sensations. And in my use presently, sensations can be real or imaginary. So when I talk about sensations, they can be sensations of what you're seeing or what you're imagining in your mind's eye, for instance. Now, neuroscience gives us every reason to think that every sensational experience is created, or at least facilitated, through neuronal activity. This is an aspect of what I call the mind-brain connection assumption. Put more generally, this assumption is that every aspect of every experience in your mind is correlated with activity in your brain. So everything that happens in your mind has something related happening in the brain, which causes it to happen, if you want to put it like that. So to briefly summarize what we know about sight, light falling on our retinas causes chemical reactions in cells, which generate electric impulses. These electric impulses are sent along the optic nerves and soon divide into a stream of pulses for computing first non-conscious responses to visual stimuli, and also, as I mentioned before, a stream for processing consciously mediated responses to visual stimuli. The processing of visual information that's not associated with creating experience goes to create non-conscious reflex responses to visual data without involving an experience of sight. I'll explain that a bit in a minute. Other nerve impulses created through optical stimulation are sent to be processed into vision, that is the experience of vision, in the visual cortex, which is right at the back of the brain now. Only the route of optical processing into the visual cortex via the lateral geniculate nucleus, as you can see there, involves the creation of conscious sight. So any other information from the optic nerve that doesn't go through there is an automatic reflex information. The conscious processing route just isn't fast enough sometimes. That's why there's a non-conscious route. It takes extra time for the brain to do the extra processing needed to create conscious experience and for the experiencer there then to consciously react. So a non-conscious processing of visual information from the eye makes sense. It means you can instinctively catch something thrown at you or duck to avoid something flying at you, even before you've had time to consciously register that's happening, let alone think about what to do about it. So further evidence, so that's one distinction between conscious and non-conscious processing of information that I want to make, which is fairly well attested. Further evidence of the non-conscious processing of visual information in the brain can be seen in the well-attested phenomenon of blind sight. In blind sight, a person does not have a subjective experience of seeing due to, for instance, brain damage, but can still respond to visual information. So if, for example, you ask them to put a letter in a box or catch a ball thrown to them, they can do it even though they can't see, in terms of not having a visual subjective experience of seeing, but they can still react as if they are seeing. Now, blind sight and reflex visual reactions both show that the human brain can process visual information in complex ways without this processing being itself associated with a conscious experience of seeing. Specifically, the brain can process visual form and object information and use this as a guide to action without any experience being involved. And this, I think, is all that's needed to show that not all sophisticated processing of information necessarily results in consciousness, which is an important result on the coming argument. Yet sophisticated responses to the environment like this, I think it would be fair to say, are examples of intelligent behaviour. In other words, since we know that non-conscious processing of and response to information can happen in the human brain, we know that intelligent behaviour does not necessarily imply consciousness, at least not all the time. So neither complex behaviour nor information processing complexity can by themselves mark the difference between consciousness and consciousness in a machine. You will have noticed, however, that as well as a non-conscious pathway of brain activity for visual processing, there is a conscious pathway in the human brain, a pathway of neuronal activity associated with the creation of our visual experience. And here is a breakdown of some of the areas of the brain where the information goes and what it does, if you like. Indeed, activity in the human visual cortex is the only physical thing we know with absolute certainty is immediately associated with the experience of seeing. So perhaps the best evidential reason we have to believe that no conscious experience of vision or any other sensation has been created artificially yet is that no present technology is in detail similar to the human sensory cortex, which we know is associated with the creation of sensational experiences, such as seeing, colour, or motion. As far as I know, although perhaps someone will correct me, there are no artificial information processing systems processing sensory information with anything like the subtlety and sophistication of the mammalian brain. But why would we assume that anything much simpler would yield a subjective experience of seeing? In any case, the only physical thing we know for sure is associated with conscious seeing or any other sensations is the activity in the human visual cortex, or the brain generally. And we haven't created anything like that in any detail. So we have no good reason to believe that any machine has yet attained any sort of sensational experience. The advantages of consciousness. The non-conscious processing of and reaction to information is much faster than the conscious processing of it. So an interesting question here is, what's the point of consciousness? Why might consciousness evolve if non-conscious processing is faster? What function does consciousness serve? In our present context, we could phrase this question as, what would be the advantage of creating consciousness if we've already created intelligent behavior? Well, what are the advantages of consciousness for human beings? I'll consider just one possibility. I'm sure there are others. I get this idea from a contributor to the Philosophy Now, David Hodgson, in Philosophy Now issue 65. And he says the difference between consciousness and mere behavior is the difference between a set of evolved programmed responses to the environment and a choice made through comprehension or understanding. By understanding, I specifically mean the ability to grasp information in context. So conscious awareness plausibly allows treating incoming sensory information, such as visual information, as integrated or whole, rather than merely processing sensory input as individual bits of information, never grasped in terms of a wider whole. And that's the difference that consciousness makes. To be able to grasp a whole and analyze it as a whole, rather than in bits. If this is true, then the role of conscious experience for an organism is to present the context as a whole for information analysis. Without consciousness, there are just separate flows of information to be dealt with. They may be compared, but not contextualized. So consciousness is crucial for comprehended context. If this is true, then the development of artificial consciousness would be crucial to allow full artificial responses to situations which require seeing information in context. And the sort of things which require context for understanding include anything to do with or built on language. Knowing the meaning of language, as opposed to mechanically applying the rules of grammar, for instance, plausibly requires conscious awareness in just this way, since the meaning of words is always context dependent. We may even learn language in contexts of experience. So if you want to process well the implications of what's being said in a conversation, you must be conscious. So having a proper conscious conversation with a machine might require the machine to be aware of what both you and it were saying. So it would require a machine with consciousness. Moreover, requiring consciousness for contextual apprehension sets an upper limit to the level to which even intelligent behaviour might be artificially achieved. What I'm saying is there is a level of intelligent mere behaviour beyond which conscious understanding would be needed, even for greater intelligence in the behaviour. So, for instance, beyond the limits of artificial intelligence, which limits are an awareness of context, we need artificial consciousness. In other words, we would need to develop artificial consciousness to make a machine aware of context and be able to analyze context. In jargon terms, to overcome the so-called framing problem in artificial intelligence, we need subjective experience which can put items of interest within the frame. Now, someone cleverer than me might say something wise here about Kurt Gödel, having demonstrated almost a century ago that we need consciousness to process context as a whole, but I'm not that clever. So now let me try and persuade you that sensations, that is qualia or percepts if you prefer, are the building blocks of all the contents of experience. That is, I want to make the case that no sensations means no experience. This fact would have immediate and significant relevance for any attempt to create artificial consciousness. Many previous artificial intelligence models have taken a top-down approach, starting by trying to electronically embody the most sophisticated aspects of human consciousness, our processes of abstract thinking, also known as cognition. Now, you might get a degree of intelligent behavior by roughly emulating the brain's activity for cognition, but you'll never get conscious awareness through that alone. This is because the building blocks of experience, as I'm going to argue, are structured sensations. Try to construct consciousness from abstract cognitive thinking down would be like trying to build a palace without having first made the bricks, because sensations are the bricks of conscious experience, if you like. But indeed, to try to create any experience without creating sensations is like trying to create a palace not only without bricks, but with no building materials at all. The top-down approach doesn't make sense for other reasons too. For instance, abstract thought is the contender for the highest product of natural selection or evolution. In trying to reconstruct consciousness, why would you start at the most complex level? No, build up from the most basic levels of experience upwards. But first, what exactly are these bricks which I'm saying the contents of conscious experience are supposedly made of? The substance or very being of sensational experience is the experience themselves, the colors, sounds, textures, and so on. At their most basic and unstructured, I call these raw sensations. But sensations are not often experienced as individual raw qualia. Rather, we generally experience qualities of sensation in complex arrangements as what I call structured sensations, the image of a woman's face, for example, or a multi-timbered saxophone note, or the taste of a sip of wine. These complex structured sensations are what the philosophers called qualia or qualia, and the neurologists and psychologists called percepts. So breaking this concept down a little, the quality of a sensation is what it would be like to experience a raw sensation, And the structure of sensational experience is how these qualities of the sensation relate to one another in each experience. Let me emphasize, though, that I don't think raw sensations are generated independent of the structure that they're experienced in. So on the contrary, I think all complex experiences are generated in or for awareness precisely as the experiences they're experienced as. How could it be otherwise than experiences are inexperienced precisely as the experiences they are? But most of the time our experiences are complex, or in other words, have a structure at least. Now, the total context for any one means of sensation in any one moment of experience is sometimes called a gestalt by psychologists. Furthermore, each moment of sensory experience, such as your seeing or hearing, is formed from many structured sensations all together. So not only at the moment, not only are you seeing something, but you're also hearing something and possibly feeling something too. And that's the limit of complexity of merely sensational awareness. After sensation, experience, though, becomes even more complex by the introduction of language. But as I say, I'm going to want to start with sensations. So the idea is that structured sensations, also known as qualia, are the building blocks of each moment of everyday experience or imagination, upon which any experience more complex, such as understanding language, is built. For instance, you hearing my words depends on you experiencing different pitches and volumes generated through my mouth. Also, thinking in words requires hearing or seeing words or other symbols in your mind, which again requires sensations, the sensations of the words, although this time obviously imaginary ones. Now, I would justify the assertion that sensations are the building blocks of all complex experience, including language, in a couple of ways. First, consider the dumb beasts. The evident existence of animals with sense awareness but without language or reason is, I think, an irrefutable reason to believe that consciousness is constructed from the sensational level up. Like me, you probably don't often think to even ask whether cats, dogs, hogs, or horses, indeed all mammals, and probably all birds too, have conscious experience. From their behaviour, we simply assume that animals smell, see, hear, taste, and feel the world. But to a large extent, we also think this is a pre-linguistic level of experience. To spell this out, we assume complex animals, or even complex animals such as cats and dogs and guinea pigs, experience their world sensationally, but without having a full language experience as we have. And it's plausible that some animals experience sensations without having any expression or understanding of language at all, even the most rudimentary, moles, for instance, or a student party late on a Friday night. Even for those species which have limited language use, their sensations operate even in the absence of words, as do ours too. We too can experience without thinking words, but we can't think any words without thinking the sensations of these words. There can be no language in the absence of sensations, so sensations is primary. Also, consider babies. Babies have sensations of the world before they develop the use of language, so that's another reason to think sensations are primary. Sensational experience comes before language evolutionarily too. I mean, the developing of the neural processing for sensations is prior to the development of the brain's language centers. Of course it is, you might say. Sensation existed before language. How could it be otherwise? But this is precisely what I'm saying too. Indeed, I say sensation must be first in the creation of experience content in all ways. So unknown exceptions notwithstanding, I'm persuaded that all creatures with a sensational cortex or its neuronal equivalent, such as birds, for instance, who don't have a cortex but has something like a cortex, or something which does the same job as the human cortex, All of these animals that have a cortex have sensational experience, because the cortex is where sensational experience is created in the human brain and analogously in other animals too. I also think all such animals with cortices have experiential variations of pleasure and pain and emotions, but for the sake of keeping things simple, let me say for now that physical pleasure and pain are special types of sensations, and emotions are special types of experiential constructs from sensations. But the point is to have some type of experience, something it's like to be anything. Animals and humans, who are animals too obviously, evidently only need an experience of sensations. Indeed, the first time any animal had a sensational experience, any animal at all had any sensational experience, was the birth of consciousness on Earth, and as far as we know, the birth of consciousness in the universe. So these are some contenders for the first bringers of conscious awareness to the universe. Surely the very structure of your own experience clearly shows you that sensations are the bricks from which more complex thought is built. For a start, you know communication could not occur without the heard, seen or felt sensations that form the words or other signs being expressed, whether in terms of spoken and heard words, written words that can be seen, or in the case of Braille, felt, or words expressed and seen through sign language. Some form of sensation needs to be the vehicle to express words and their intonations. And this is before getting into the extra experience content that makes language use different from, say, just making random sounds or waving your hands. The meaning conveyed through words must be different from just the sensation of the words. Otherwise, you'd understand any Egyptian or Sumerian you heard or saw just as well as you understand me now, but I'm presuming you don't. Next on the level of complexity of thought and consciousness, reasoning or thinking involves linguistically reflecting on linguistic or sensational experience. So cognition is a higher type of experience, even from linguistic understanding per se. So you understand language and then you reflect on what you understand, and that's cognition, is what I'm saying, basically. Similarly to language, cognition also must have its distinct concepts, different from sensations, and also from the contents of language understanding per se, just to mark out in your experience the difference between the experience of reason and those simpler types of experience. As I would argue, without the use of language, reasoning is at least severely limited, and reasoning is impossible with no sensations at all. Abstract thought is the most sophisticated type of thought we know of, and abstract thought depends on linguistic systems of symbols. Linguistic symbols, as language, is built from sensation, so all thought is built on sensation, or at least any potential sensationless experience would be a rare and singular case, an experience of nirvana maybe, or some other rarity of experience. We might call this sensational experience of existence the null experience, but as you might imagine, conscious experience, contentless experience is impossible to imagine. If you imagine it, it's no longer contentless. And contentless experience isn't the same as death, if death means no experience. Meanwhile, not everything with a functioning nervous system has a mind, I believe. Indeed, I think the neurologically simplest creatures, such as insects, are like tiny robots. They respond to the world by neurologically processing data from their sense mechanisms, but without any subjective experience. In other words, they sense and respond to the world, but without an aware mind. And I think this may be true of all creatures significantly less neurologically complex than birds or reptiles, so poor little frogs too. Since, as far as I know, reptiles are the simplest animals whose brains have an equivalent of a sensory cortex. Frogs don't. Perhaps then worms, spiders, flies, even fish are all robots responding to the world without experiencing it. Maybe, like a rock, there is nothing it is like to be a slug or a pilchard. But in summary, the main categories of the contents of consciousness, or what consciousness is made of, are raw sensations, structured sensations, linguistic meaning, then higher reflection, including reasoning and self-reflection. Other aspects of experience, most notably emotions, I would try to account for under this scheme. But for all of these, if there are no sensational qualities, there's no experience. And if there's no experience, there is no consciousness, or at least not enough of one to be the usual subject. The chasm to bridge in understanding how the brain could create or channel consciousness then is the chasm between the different natures of matter and experience. Since no sensational experience means no experience, to explain consciousness, we would therefore need to explain how sensations, the experience of yellow, the taste of salt, the sound of my words, and so on, are generated by the electrical and chemical exchanges between the synapses and neurons in pathways in your brain. So, the so-called hard problem of consciousness is at its basis or foundation the problem: how is a sensation created through electrical chemical activity in the brain? And that's solve that, and you solve the problem, the hard problem of consciousness. I'm saying, you know how experience is created by brain activity. Once our initial experiences, our sensations, have been created in our brains, building language, rational thought, and emotion from them is no longer philosophically problematic, at least I would say, although it might be a difficult thing to understand from an engineering point of view. Still. Interestingly, the initial engineering task for solving how the brain creates consciousness is also answering the question, how is a sensation created through electrical and chemical activity in the brain? Now, what do we know about this? What do we know about how sensation is created in the brain? Well, unfortunately, neuroscientists presently know little more about how the brain makes sensations than where types of sensation processing are headquartered. For instance, somatosensory means where you can feel, where your feeling of touch is made by the brain. And we also know a lot about the biochemistry driving neuronal signaling. As impressive as all that is, this falls abysmally short of telling us how the brain makes experience. But we know there must be something about neuronal activity in these areas by which the associated sensations are created or accessed, because, for instance, when people lose these areas or connections with the areas, they lose the experience. In this sort of way, we know, for example, where your experience of hearing is made in your brain. When those areas are cut off, they might have every other functioning of their minds, but lose the power to hear, for instance. But what we do not yet know is how the brain creates sound experience, for instance. Let's focus, however, on the creation of visual sensations. This is probably what neuroscience knows the most about, and it's in fact the area of the brain which has the largest amount of processing. It's the sense, visual information has as much processing given over to it as all the other senses combined in the brain, which is a lot. What do we know about how the human brain creates visual sensations? Well, after initial sorting, most nerve signals from the retina are received by the visual cortex. There it is again at the back of the brain, curiously enough. The streams of neuronal signaling from both eyes that we associated with conscious visual experience spread out across the lower back surface of the brain on both hemispheres of the brain, out from primary visual area V1, the bullseye in the diagram, right at the bottom of the back of the brain. V1 computes which areas to send the different aspects of retinal information to for further processing. In this, V1 acts like a switchboard for different types of information coming from the eyes, for motion or color, for instance. The inferotemporal cortex along the bottom of the visual area processes the color and form of objects in the visual field and helps identify objects based on their color and form by comparing that processed information to memories of objects. Memories are held elsewhere in the brain. Neuronal signaling, primarily in area V4, which is a little patch there you can locate, at the rear of the brain, just below your ears, in fact, is responsible for the generation of your experience of color, either real or imaginary. So that little area on both hemispheres of the brain is the headquarters for where your experience of color is created by the brain. But areas B6 and B7 are also implicated, for example, and in fact, a lot of other brain activity is also going to be involved. But B4 is where is centered the creation of the colors involved in you seeing the room you're seeing now, or the color of something, as they say, merely in your mind, like the gold of the unicorn's horn that I'm hoping you may well now be imagining. And I say that B4 is where your brain makes colors. Of course, it isn't as simple as that. Instead, this will turn out to be two sorting centers for a larger network of brain activity involved in seeing colors. But this doesn't affect the principle that neuronal activity in our brains is responsible for the existence of our experience of colors, and that we know at least that this activity clusters around the area V4. There are also areas in the visual cortex on both brain hemispheres for computing form, in other words, the shape of what you see, the shape of our visual percepts, to use the psychological term, or what I call the structure of visual sensations. The processing of form seems to be concentrated in areas V2 and V3 in almost concentric rings around V1. And the apparent motion of what we see is processed a little further up. And neurologists believe that the form and motion visual areas connect with color processing areas in B4 to B7, and that from their interaction, we get structured colored visual experience. That is what we commonly call sight. From an engineering point of view, it's interesting that in the case of human vision, at least, the brain's computing for the structural aspect of visual experience, in other words, the structure of our experience, is independent of and may well precede the processing for the qualitative aspect. So what the colors and tones of what we see, for instance. Computing the form of the experience comes first then, and the resultant plan computed is filled in through the color experience whose activity is coordinated through the areas V4 to V7. This would be in order to bear in mind when trying to create artificial consciousness, and I promise I'll get onto that soon. In any case, this would be the sort of level of resolution we currently have about what we know is happening in the brain concerning the creation of experience, in this case, sight. We also know a lot about the chemistry involved, yet we still don't have a clue how conscious sight happens, or even though we know all this. The questions arise such as, why does this system or this configuration of activity in these areas of the brain create this particular conscious experience, for instance? But I would say the brain's creation of sensational experience is the primary nut to crack in understanding consciousness. One interesting question is, what does the brain do differently in those areas or activities that create sensations compared to other areas? This question splits into empirical and theoretical questions. Any observable difference between sensational brain activity and activity in the rest of the brain belongs to the neuroscientists. So anything you can observe let the scientists work out. But in terms of, and this will come down to such things as the shape of the neurons, the nature of their interconnections, the rates of cell firing, and the neurochemistry involved. But we could know all that well and still not at all understand how sensation is created through that activity. Meanwhile, a good question for understanding the philosophical difference between sensation creating brain activity and other brain activities is, what would the brain activity for creating sensations have to be able to do to create sensations? Take colors, for example. What must the brain activity for creating an experience of colors be able to do to create the experiences of colors that we have? Now, if brain activity creates or facilitates sensations, then clearly processes in our brains must be able to specify those sensations, at least to the degree of difference between the sensations we actually experience. So if you can experience different types of blue, and this experience is due to activity in your brain, then your brain must be able to tell the difference between, or specify the difference between these different shades of blue that you can experience. Specification is necessary for specific creation, I would say. So in creating our color experiences, one thing brain activity must be able to do is to specify color experiences, at least to the level of specificity to which we experience colors. Of course, not only does the brain have to specify different colors, it has to create the colors it specifies. As I mentioned, how the brain creates sensations is the precise kernel of the hard problem of consciousness. For those who are interested, let me briefly say what my own theory about this is. But unfortunately or fortunately, we don't have time to go into this in any detail. So briefly, my idea for how the brain creates sensations is first, that brain activity, this is a metaphor, brain activity encodes something equivalent to coordinates, which specifies sensational experiences among what I call a natural ordering of those sensations. So you've got something like a color wheel in the abstract, and brain activity specifies the coordinates for whichever color it's creating. This is so fine, but the second part of the theory is the real metaphysical depth charge. And this says that when the brain specifies sensations in whatever sort of way it does so, the sensations are thereby created for the mind. The principle necessary for conscious experience to happen is that when some abstract mental quality is accurately physically represented in the right sort of way by, for instance, brain activity specifying a position of a color in an abstract logical arrangement of them, then the mental content is specified. In other words, neuronal activity specifies, say, a sensation from among all the different possible sensations, and in specifying it, it creates the experience of that sensation. This would mean that accurately specifying a color itself creates the experience of the color, and so on for each sensation. And if this is true, this will have all sorts of implications for the nature of reality, but which unfortunately I cannot get into right now. But instead, I want to talk about creation of artificial consciousness. So since sensation is the beginning of consciousness, as I've just extensively argued, to create artificial consciousness, one person needs to emulate the sensation creation that occurs through brain activity. This plausibly also needs to be tied to self-reflection enabling brain activity, and who knows what else. But let's suppose then that we do eventually discover how to emulate the way the human brain specifies sensations, and that with the additional suitable feedback mechanisms, we can create artificial sensational experiences which an artificial mind is capable of having. So far, we've artificially created the consciousness equivalent of less than a cat or a dog. To create something as sophisticated as a human mind capable of abstract reasoning, several other elements are needed. So the first step up from the simplest form of experience, which is structured sensation, is to expressing or receiving language. For artificial consciousness, as opposed to artificial intelligence, once again, this wouldn't just involve the contemporary AI practice of breaking down human grammatical structures so that the machine can rearrange and output pre-recorded symbols in a humanoid way. Rather, in contrast to the artificial simulation of mere behaviour of using language, artificially creating an understanding of language involves creating an experience of linguistic meaning concerning what's being communicated. I said that experiencing linguistic meaning involves understanding the context of the use of word signs, and that understanding context may require consciousness. But more specifically, to create linguistic understanding, and so to create any thought dependent on language, would require recreating something like the linguistic content of the human mind during our experience of language. And this means replicating the sort of thing that's going on in your mind, which makes the difference between understanding a meaningful utterance and hearing a meaningless set of sounds. There must be something happening in your mind at the very moment of understanding any language that marks the difference between just seeing or hearing signs and those signs being understood linguistically, or seeing them, perhaps. Or if you didn't have linguistic understanding, you just have the sensation of them, is what I'm saying. For instance, this mental content of linguistic understanding, whatever it is, that makes the difference between the understanding you have of the meaning of what I'm saying now compared to the meaningless sounds you'd hear if I was saying the same things in Swahili. We need to know precisely what this experience is, this aspect of thought, this aspect of meaningful understanding is, before we can make artificial language awareness possible. But unfortunately, what the immediate mental content of linguistic understanding is has never been systematically looked into as a research program, or even much recognized as existing, as far as I know. To summarize it very briefly, my own idea is that in terms of the immediate mental content of the mind doing the understanding of language, an experience of linguistic meaning involves the words and phrases we're hearing or seeing being associated with experiences in the back of our minds. That is to say, these experiences are mostly liminal, meaning at the edge of consciousness. So the content of our understanding of language is a bunch of experiences at the back of our mind, maybe just hinted at. Otherwise, I take it that these experiences are like our consciously present experiences in some ways. Of course, there's significantly more to understanding language than this can indicate. In any case, there's a lot of work ahead to analyze precisely what's present in the mind of the experience, so which constitutes their understanding of language. But that is only the beginning. Sorry if you can hear somebody singing in the background there. Once we understand that complex issue, for artificial replication of language use, we must also analyze how the brain creates that experience of language. And I also predict experiential and neurological feedback in our linguistic understanding. So good luck in usefully disentangling that plate of brain spaghetti. Now, a monkey can shriek different sounds that stand for the snake, eagle or lion that she can see. These signs stand for something right there in her experience. We might even allow that the monkey can use these same shrieks in the absence of the creature, when the image of the threat rises up in her memory. We can call this concrete thinking in languages to distinguish this responding to sensations from abstract thought or language use. But abstract thought is necessary for human level thinking. So abstract thinking is not just mentally attaching signs to percepts, that is, words to things one can directly perceive, such as a lion or a snake. Rather, an abstract concept is one for which there's no evident sensational reference. That is, although sensational associations can be suggested by abstract concepts, these concepts are not defined by what you can sense. So consider justice, love, beauty, or truth. There's nothing we can see or otherwise sense or imagine that would adequately define any of these abstract concepts, and that's why they're abstract. By definition, abstract thoughts involves mental contents which cannot be understood only in terms of sensations. If it could be, the thinking would not be abstract. So we should not think that concrete language involves a capability for abstract thought. Monkeys or any animals which have some concrete animals do not thereby have the brain modules and so the mind for abstract thought and language. So I'll put the prefrontal cortex as the core area for abstract thought in human reasoning, if you want to put it like that, if you allow me to put it like that. So Immanuel Kant, among others, called the facility of thought beyond sensation the intellect, and there he is. So we can say that the last stage in the creation of proper artificial consciousness would be to create an artificial intellect. And as was the case with language, to replicate the high human intellectual ability to think abstractly, which means to really think, oh, there you go, really thinking, we need first to understand precisely what's going on in human minds when we're having abstract thoughts. Then, once we know what we're experiencing when we're having abstract thoughts, we must match these experiences with brain processes in detail to extract principles which we would apply to artificially recreate them. So this is always what is necessary to actually create artificial consciousness, rather than just merely artificial intelligence. The finesse in the creation of artificial consciousness would be the recreation, not just of the having of abstract ideas, but the recreation of the ability to think about abstract ideas. The intellectual comparison of both abstract and concrete ideas is what we call reasoning. In our present context, you can understand that I'm not just talking about manipulating an electronic flow of data to produce results that look like reasoning to humans, which would be a good way of summarizing artificial intelligence. I'm talking about creating an entity that's not only aware of having abstract thoughts, but also has experiences in which these abstract thoughts are consciously, deliberately thought about. When we can recreate thinking about abstract and concrete ideas, then we can create true artificial consciousness. At this point, we ought to distinguish between what we can know about what's going on and what is going on. In philosophical jargon, we need to distinguish between the epistemology and the ontology, and I will explain that. So suppose we create consciousness in a machine by meticulously emulating the activity of the human brain in the sort of ways I've talked about, or maybe some other way. A machine whose level of processing sophistication emulates human brain activity might not only behave intelligently in the way necessary for full artificial intelligence, but if it's suitably embodied as a realistic android, could respond in ways that make it indistinguishable from a human. It could pass any Turing test. Any observer of its behavior would easily believe it to be conscious. Is this enough, though, to conclude that it is actually conscious? Although judging behavior, that is output, may be the obvious test of conscious awareness, it is in fact not a good reason for saying that consciousness is embodied. A better indicator for the presence of consciousness would be through the hardware, via what we might be called a cross-platform comparative anatomy. That is to say, we already have a good map of which areas and activities of the human brain have which aspects of consciousness associated with them again. So to reliably infer sensational or any other actual subjective experience in a machine, or indeed in an animal, we need to see functional hardware equivalencies to these areas. In fact, the presence of levels of processing equivalent to the brain's processing of human thought would be the only good empirical reason we would have to infer consciousness. For example, we have good reasons to think that our visual cortex is necessary for the creation of our visual experience. So if a machine lacks equivalent areas in function to our visual cortex, down to the details, then we'd have good reason to think that it doesn't have visual experience. In other words, it doesn't have visual consciousness. And precisely, in fact, to the extent that it lacks the equivalent to our visual cortex, as well as whatever other brain activities we find to be necessary for sight. So behaviour itself won't tell us, since mere intelligent behaviour can be mechanically encoded. But perhaps I should emphasise that, for instance, having visual experience isn't the same as responding to visual stimuli. The most basic robot can be programmed to modify its behaviour in response to incoming photons. But in spite of this intelligent behaviour, we have good reason to believe it doesn't experience what it responds to. This good reason is precisely that it doesn't have the hardware or software specifying visual information in anything like approaching the level of detail of activity patterns in the human visual cortex and across the human brain. This activity is what makes sight for us, so why should we think that what lacks something equivalent to that could have sight? But now, instead, suppose that the behavior of the machine is up to or beyond the intelligence of a wide range of human behaviors, and that its hardware and software are sophisticated to the level of detail of the functioning human brain. Even in these optimal circumstances, we still couldn't say for sure that the machine was conscious, even if it told us it was conscious. The evidence for its awareness is still only circumstantial. We can't look inside the mind of the machine into its thoughts and experiences to confirm that it's thinking. We might say we have the best reasons possible to believe we know for sure. So finally, in conclusion, to summarize, if we can't create sensational experience, then we can't create consciousness. But generating artificial sensation-filled awareness turns out to be a lot more complex than generating a sophisticated set of data processing algorithms. Rather, to create artificial experience, we first have to emulate our brain code for both accessing and combining sensations, and then possibly integrate this with artificial neural-like activity for self-reflection, as well as artificial versions of currently unknown other human brain processes. But basically, to create even the rudiments of artificial consciousness, we'd have to construct a system with a level of operation equivalent to that of the sensory cortex of, say, a mammal, as well as other relevant brain activity aspects. So in short, even to create only the sensational aspect of experience would mean creating an artificial brain. Who's surprised by that? On reflection, it seems very plausible that we need something as complex as a bird or mammal brain to specify sensations sharply enough to recreate them for a mind artificially. So let's suppose then that to artificially create even basic experience, we need to encode data at least as subtly as the mammal brain does in its sensation creating aspects. To do this, we'd have to know how the brain code for specifying and generating sensations actually works well enough to derive principles that we could apply to machines. Yet not even half the task of creating artificial consciousness is finished when we've done that. Rather, to create full artificial consciousness at a human sort of level, which is consciousness at the level of abstract reasoning, we would have to well understand all of the levels of types of human experience in detail, in terms of what it's like to have that type of experience, then deconstruct the brain code for every aspect of experience, then know in detail how the brain wires all of these aspects of mind together into a single mind, then derive principles and mathematical and or logical models from all these knowledge, and then emulate these models together in a machine. This constitutes what I might justifiably call a long-term research program. But the unholy grail at the end of this process will be the power to create artificial consciousness. Thank you. And there's some credits. Okay.
Well, Grant, thank you very much indeed. I mean, what a lecture! Not only philosophy, it was philosophy, neuroscience, biology, sociology. I mean, it was a riveting ride. Thank you very
Okay, good.
much.
Glad you got something of it. I think there was a lot there, maybe a lot to take in one go. But
no, but I think it's been,
everyone.
I think everybody really would have appreciated the fact that you actually went through this step by step, and I think that's really, really helpful. So, I mean, the least we can do is give you a big round of applause. So, if everybody could unmute themselves,
Okay,
please, and we give Grant a big round of applause.
Thank you.
Well, as you can imagine, Grant, there's been quite a few questions in the chat room.
Jolly good.
And we'll go through them now. But before I go into the chat room, is there anybody who wants to ask a question themselves, by unmuting themselves and ask a question before I read out some of them in the chat room? For example, Anna Beria, you had a question in the chat room. Do you want to unmute and ask it yourself, or do you want me to ask it?
Yes, I can ask it myself. If I can find it again.
Yeah.
My first question as I was listening to Grant was to wonder whether it is now generally accepted by contemporary philosophers that some animals, and by that I mean mammals, are not only capable of intelligent behavior, but also have some form of self-awareness, as evidenced by the fact that when they see themselves in a mirror, they can actually touch parts of their body to see the effect on the mirror image. So they do not necessarily perceive the image as a potential enemy.
I think that's generally accepted as proof of self-awareness or something. I mean, I would say that self-awareness is not an on or off thing to start with. Maybe there's a continuum of growing self-awareness. So there is that one has to take into account. And also one has to, it's a truism about philosophy that if there's a view, then there's also somebody holding the opposite view. So I'm sure there'll be somebody arguing against it. But I would say, yeah, generally speaking, that's taken, the mirror test is taken as a sign of some degree of self-awareness, as I say, on a continuum with, I don't know, let's say Jean-Paul Sartre or Simone de Beauvoir at the top of the self-awareness continuum, and a monkey or a cat looking in the mirror at the bottom, something like that.
All right, thank you.
Okay, we've got a different question, which I didn't expect, from Catherine Tilko. Does a thermostat experience sensation?
I would say no, and the reason I said no, I sort of hinted at it, but as I say, I couldn't get into everything that I think about this thing. But I would say no, because my theory is that in order for the brain to create an experience of sensation, it needs to specify sensation in a particular sort of way, which allows it to access information about sensations in the abstract. And I don't think a thing like a thermostat would have that sort of specification. It obviously specifies, say, information to us, but we're already experiencing, so we can't sort of communicate our experience onto that, or imply our experience onto the things we're experiencing. So it's not the right sort of specification of information in order to create sensations, is what I'd say in the summary.
Yeah, okay. No, thank you, Grant. It's a bit like saying, does a thermostat know what a thermostat is? You know,
there is you might have heard of panpsychism, which is the currently trending for some unknown reason idea in philosophy that everything has consciousness. But I don't follow that. I think we only know that things with complex nervous systems have consciousness. So I would sort of put that as a bar. And as I said, my sort of limit is things with cortices or the equivalent of cortices in the detail of their functioning would be my sort of bar for where consciousness starts to exist.
Okay. I'm reading out another question for a statement from Anna, actually. Birds and mammals communicate between themselves and in some cases with us and with other species through displays and through noise, which is meaningful to them. And the other being experiencing it. In addition, chimpanzees, let me just forward it. Chimpanzees have been trained to use symbols to express complex ideas, and there's evidence that knowledge is passed on from one to the next. So, any views on that?
I don't disagree with anything she said. Is it a question?
Well, I think I suppose Anna will probably say animals do have language.
Yeah, again, I wouldn't deny that, but I did make a distinction, which I should emphasize between, first of all, between concrete and abstract language. So concrete language would be the sort of language that I'd give to most animals who have language use. In other words, they attach, there's a sensation or a memory of a sensation that they can attach to a shriek or a sign, and that's concrete because it's relating an experience, something that can be experienced to let's call it a word. So that's one level. And then there's abstract language use, which is the use of signs which aren't necessarily connected with a sensation. So I can talk about justice or love or beauty. And although you can think of examples of these examples aren't the same as the concept themselves.
Yeah.
And I don't think most animals would have that level. In fact, linking it with the self-awareness issue, which Anna also brought up, I think that self-awareness is the first step, if you like, of abstract thinking, so that any animal which has self-awareness is to that extent also venturing into abstract thought. So, and some of them are quite developed. So, I don't know, a whale or a dolphin. I mean, I think dolphins have complex abstract language use. I don't think that's a really radical thing to say, but I don't think dogs do. I think dogs are somewhere on the continuum, but they're not, capable of abstract language use in the way that I think maybe whales and dolphins are.
Okay, good. Thank you very much for that, Grant. Duncan, I'm coming to you now in the chat room, and I see you're unmuted. So do you want to ask your question yourself? Duncan, are you there?
Well, basically, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yep. Something's gone wrong. Never mind, you can't see me. Second.
I can see you too.
Okay. There's this character called Etienne Bonneau de Condillac who wrote a treatise about sensations. And he held the view that a statue, if it was capable of feeling a sensation in its toe, would therefore be able to gradually develop the entire capacity for abstract thought. And it struck me that you're very similar to Condillac, except that you're more interested in trying to find a scientific explanation as to exactly how that happens. I'd just say, to come back to you after a while, Condillac did have a problem, but I'd be interested in knowing what your view is.
Sorry, what's the problem?
Well, okay, the problem is judgment. You see, Condillac might be able to say, yes, the sensation of cold is opposite to the sensation of warmth. Therefore, I can feel warmth and cold, etc., etc. But the problem that Condillac couldn't account for was the fact that to be able to judge something, right, to be more than something else or less than something else, was not something that he was capable of experiencing through his toe.
Yeah. I'm going to fall back, I think, on a bit of a Immanuel Kant perhaps. The faculty of judgment has to be separate from the faculty of sensation, for sure, which makes it an intellectual faculty. In other words, judgment is an abstract thing that you do. You abstract from the things you're judging between. So yes, you'd have to have an intellect. You can't. Sensation itself, which I take it the most simple animals with cortices have, doesn't imply that they have judgment, even though they can react. Even though they can react to warmer or colder in appropriate ways, this doesn't mean that they're aware of something as warmer or colder. They're just aware of sensation. Yeah. And so the judgment itself is a level higher, which I would put in the abstract level. Does that answer your question, or is there more?
Well, my view would be that even abstraction can be quite concrete. Sorry, yeah, I mean, a judgment can be quite concrete. You know, be able to tell, to Jude Geach's example between the sharpness of a knife and the sharpness of a spoon, right? requires a sensational input. Yeah. But unfortunately, you can't deduce the judgmental capacity from the sensational input.
Yeah, I think that's broadly what I said, or in agreement with what I said.
Okay, thanks very much. Yes, sorry, I don't want to dominate. Thanks.
No, thank you, Duncan.
Do read Condillac. Do read Condillac. It's a good writer.
Yeah,
I'll put him on my extending list.
18th century.
Well, extend your consciousness, Grant.
Oh yes, I could do a bit of that maybe.
There you go. I've got Mark Crocker, and I think he's not in the meeting anymore, so I'll read it for everybody. Are any experiments being conducted using biological material to process information in a machine environment in an attempt to mimic conscious behavior? So this is a bit like fusing the biological and the cyborg.
No, I'm sure there are, but I can't. That's not. That would be an area for the actual technologists to speak on. I'm not really in that area. I'm sure there are, though. Would be surprised because people try anything, don't they?
Well, I think, yeah. I mean, one of the questions I would actually ask you, Grant, is do you believe that in going to artificial consciousness now, do you believe that an artificial consciousness needs to have something akin to the perceptual apparatus and processing power of a brain, or specifically a prefrontal cortex, to be able to be conscious?
Well, again, it depends what you mean by conscious. Most animals don't have a prefrontal cortex. Only the Homo genus. Yeah. But most animals have sensation and have experience of sensation. Animals, as I say, my belief is that any animals with a cortex or something equivalent have an experience of sensation. Many of them also have rudimentary concrete language use. Mm-hmm. Few of them, only mammals and maybe octopuses are capable of developing into the abstract language use. So there's that. But what the levels of what is possible to artificially create conscious-wise depend on what you mean by consciousness. So do you mean sensation? Do you mean language use? Do you mean abstract thought? Suppose we say the highest level, right? So is it possible for the highest level of human abstract thinking to be artificially recreated in a machine? I would say yes, if you can, if you can do all the things that I said here you could do, then you could create full artificial consciousness. But I think that's a 300-year research program rather than, say, a 30-year one. I don't think the nature of the medium is the important issue. So I don't care whether it's silicon or carbon, as long as basically the pattern of activity in the human brain can be emulated, then you can emulate consciousness somewhere else.
Okay.
That's my basic.
Yeah. No, thank you for that, Grant. Similar, well, not similar, but an AI question from Kaz. Kaz, you're still there. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask it yourself, or do you want me to ask it for you? I think Kaz hasn't unmuted, so she'll ask it.
Sorry. Hi.
Hi, Kaz.
I'm studying. Well, I've been studying the general area of AI for a couple of weeks now. So I just wanted to know whether, if we gave like a general AI, I know we're not at that point at the moment, but would it be possible for a general AI to create its own like artificial superintelligence if we gave it the opportunity to? Or would there be specific boundaries?
Do you mean intelligent behavior, or do you mean consciousness? Let me just that distinction.
I'm gonna say both. I think the artificial superintelligence as a goal does focus a lot on the consciousness and the intelligence aspect.
Well, will you let me split them up? Because
yeah, of course.
I would want to say that this artificial intelligence goal of self-learning machines that can create self-learning machines, I don't see any theoretical or philosophical problems with that happening quite imminently. But that's talking about just, if you like, the refinement of intelligent behavior without necessarily involving any consciousness in the sort of way that I was trying to indicate before. Can it be possible for a machine, for an intelligently behaving machine, to create artificial consciousness? I don't think that's gonna be how it's gonna happen. I think what's gonna have to happen if you want to create artificial consciousness in a machine is you're gonna have to, first of all, work out, as I say, how sensations are coded in brain activity, then recreate that in a machine, and then you've got a sensing machine, but so far that's quite limited. And then if you wanted to do such things as understand language, then you're going to have to work out how, first of all, what it means for a human being to understand language, and then work out how the brain does it, and then work out how to model that in a machine, and then do it in a machine. So I think that's another 100-year research program. And then if you want that machine not only to understand language, but also to think cognitively rather than just process mechanically information, then you're going to have to understand what is going on in the human mind when we think, and correlate that with behavior in the brain, and then emulate that in the machine. So that's another 100-year research program. And I think that's going to be done by research. It's going to be done by humans. How far computers are going to help them is, I wouldn't guess. More and more as the computers get more and more sophisticated, I imagine. But and a machine is never going to create its own consciousness without first having input from human beings, is the short answer, I guess.
Okay, well, you've heard it here first, the year 2321 for potential AI consciousness. Now, Mark Crocker, I've just seen the last sort of message in the chat room, so I must have said that you were no longer here. You've got a second question. Do you want to ask it yourself, or do you want me to ask it for you, Mark? Okay, I'll ask it for Mark in that case. Are we taking the line here of I think, therefore I am, rather than exploring the possibility of non-organic intelligence? Question mark.
Well, I certainly think it's true. I think, therefore, I am. Does he? I'm not really sure I understand the question, but let me see if I can interpret it. Ignoring the Descartes bit, is it, can we think, maybe he's asking, can we think in terms of consciousness other than in human terms? Do you think that's a reasonable interpretation of his question? And certainly yes, but as you know, what is it like to be a bat? I mentioned the bat thing earlier. The famous Nagel paper, he argued it's impossible for human beings to imagine what it's like being a bat. And his point was not only that we don't have echolocation, so we can't imagine what it's like to have echolocation. His point was, even if we did have echolocation, we would be human beings imagining what it would be like being a bat having an echolocation rather than being a bat having echolocation, for instance. Yeah. So yes, intelligence, animal intelligence is certainly a thing, but how far we can step into those shoes and understand it is another question, and I think quite limited.
I suppose the way I interpreted the question, I'm sure Mark will probably tell me I'm wrong, is that does AI know what it's like to be AI?
Well, this is what I'm arguing. No, it doesn't, because it hasn't got all these elements necessary for consciousness. I mean, this is, and you know, I guess my basic point is, you don't get consciousness just by programming a machine to say that it's conscious or to act as if it's conscious. You get consciousness by creating all the elements of consciousness, which, as I say, are sensations, then language, then abstract thought, including self-awareness. So until you can create these elements, sensations first, then you don't have consciousness. You have just maybe the simulation or what can even appear to be consciousness, but doesn't actually involve any consciousness.
Okay, well, we'll run out of questions in the chat room. So is there anybody else? We've got 7 minutes to go before the watershed moment. So we are going to be finishing at 9. But we've got 7 minutes if anybody else wants to ask another question. No? Okay.
Oh, hang on. If you want a question, I would really say you started off, Grant, and by the way, it was a terrific talk and I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. You
started off saying that activity in thought and activity in the brain shouldn't be confused with each other. But
no.
Weren't you getting a bit close to that?
My position is that the mind and its contents, so all your experiences and all your thoughts, are created by activity in the brain, but are not the same as the activity of the brain. So I think it's rather undeniable when you think that, say, for instance, your experience of a color red, if you look into the, as I say, the V4 area or any other area of the brain, you don't see the experience of the color red. Or when you're hearing something, the experiences are nothing like the brain activity that is responsible for creating them. And this therefore means that we should consider them as different things or in different terms.
Okay.
But as I said at the beginning, the assumption from neuroscience is that everything that happens in your mind has a correlation with something that happens in your brain.
Yes.
There is also that.
Yeah, that's I mean, what's fundamental here really is the computer model of thinking. That's the analogy that lies behind the whole thing, isn't it?
Well, I'm not sure I'm using a computer model, because I think the computer model is a bit, as I say, top down. It seems to start with, okay, this is intelligent thought, or this is abstract thought, and let's see if we can emulate that. Whereas I'm saying, why start with abstract thought? It's the most complicated aspect of consciousness. Start with the most simple aspects of consciousness. sensations. If you can't create a sensation artificially, then you're not going to have any consciousness at all, is my line.
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
Good. Right. I think we're going to draw things to a conclusion, but I think once again, it would be very useful if everybody could just unmute themselves one more time and give Grant another round of applause.
Yeah, thanks.
It's a very interesting thing.
Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Well, thank you very much, Grant. So just a bit of... Sorry? Is that me? There's feedback. Sorry about that. The one thing I would say is we're now going into June, and we were going to have Dr. Karim Ismail giving a talk on Wittgenstein. But because we're still on Zoom only in June, he has asked us to change that date for him later on in the year when we're definitely back at the BLSI. As it stands, we can either use a Daniel Dennett video in June, alternatively organize another talk, and I'm currently in conversation with the University of Bath around some of the topical psychological issues that they're currently researching. But we'll make a decision over the next week or so. So we'll keep you posted what's going to be happening in.
And I will give you a newsletter over the next little while to keep you informed.
Thank you.
But the good news is that we project to be back in the building at the BLSI from July onwards. So, you know, and what we're going to be doing, because these Zoom meetings have worked really well, we're going to do both things at the same time. So we may have a speaker in the Elwyn room, and we'll have an audience, but we'll also have a virtual audience on Zoom. So we're going to try to do both things at the same time. And likewise, we may be able to attract a speaker from other countries who may not want to travel to us, in which case they would be Zooming in, potentially to a Zoom audience, but also a live audience at the BLSI. So I think we're going to do what Grant was talking about. We're going to create a cyborg of lecture programs. Both virtual and physical. So I hope we will see each other in July onwards physically, and we will definitely see each other in June virtually. So have a good evening, everybody, and I shall see you next month. All the very best. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.